What you gonna do? What you gonna do when they come for you? Bad boys, bad boys. What you gonna do? What you gonna do when they come for you?
Hello everybody, and welcome to lecture number 15, our YouTube lecture 15. The last one we'll have in period 5. Now this one deals with Reconstruction from both the president and the congressional point of view. And we're going to see at this point is how Congress eventually rises up and takes control of the country over that of the president. Interesting stuff. Let's see. Let's look at our key concepts we'll be looking at in this lecture. We have 5.3, Roman numeral 2, A, B, and C. So we see this altered powered relationships between the state and the federal government, but also between the executive and the legislative, and eventually the judicial branches. Everything is working together to try to end slavery, but also we have a divided union, right? And they're trying to have these questions on how to bring the union back together, right? How to fix some of the social problems that have happened and some of the economic ones as well. The 13th Amendment will be passed, which will officially abolish slavery. That's its official purpose. But we have the Republican Party, as I'll mention many times, is a split party. You have both radical elements and moderate. The radical elements are the ones that don't just want to see the end of slavery, but they have become abolitionists, and they want to see former slaves become U.S. citizens and get their voting rights. Whereas the more moderate Republicans are more conservative, and they'd rather just fix the economy and marry themselves basically to the new growing industry in America. And again, here we have, right here in our key concept, a change in the balance of power between Congress and the presidency. So when I'm saying this to you, how Congress eventually usurps or gets to be more powerful than the president, hopefully you'll see how this arrangement starts here, and we'll work on it more as we get to the Gilded Age, which is the next period. Now, Hiram Revels is an example, but that's a very important name, and you should know this name. He is our first African American ever elected to Congress. He'll be elected from the state of Mississippi and actually serve in the United States Congress. So that's an extremely important moment in U.S. history, although it's not necessarily a situation where you might get a multiple choice question on it, but he would be a good example if you were able to, if they devised some sort of an essay or a short answer question for you and asked about changing social political situations for African Americans, you could use Hiram Revels as a good example. Also, key concept 5.3, Roman numeral 3, A, B, and C. Again, because we're talking about, again, how the Northern idea of American identity basically is what controls the Reconstruction period. Reconstruction, rebuilding the South. The South has lost the war, and the North wants to reconstruct it, to rebuild it basically in its image, its identity. They want to define new definitions of U.S. citizenship. We'll see that in the 14th Amendment. Also, the 15th Amendment that gives us voting rights. However, what about women's rights? Right? We'll see that there's a flaw with the 14th and 15th Amendment that I'll show you in a few moments. And we collectively refer to these again as the Civil War Amendments. Well, let's get into Reconstruction here. First of all, what was the president's plan? Well, Lincoln wanted to treat the South with a velvet glove. Man, all of a sudden I can't talk. That is silly, but I'm not going to stop this. I'm just going to let myself make mistakes in this particular video, and you can laugh at me at your own accord. He has his second inaugural address, right? He wins a second election, 1864. Of course, he doesn't get to enjoy it very long, but in his second inaugural address, he'll say, with malice toward none and charity toward all. So malice, no hurtful feelings towards the South, and charity. Let's help the country heal. He comes up with what he calls his 10% plan. Take 10% of the population within a state that voted in the year 1860. Very important to take the year 1860, because that's the last time the South voted for the president. They didn't vote in 1864. Only the North voted in the election of 1864 because, well, we were fighting the South. Hello. So if you take just 10% of that population, they take an oath of loyalty to the Union, and they ratify the 13th Amendment, you are reconstructed, you're back into the Union. Now, Lincoln is a moderate Republican. The radical Republicans do not like this. And a Mr. Wade and a Mr. Davis come up with what we call the Wade-Davis bill. More of a 50% of oath of loyalty. No one who is in any high-ranking position of the Confederacy would ever be allowed to vote or be part of the government again, and they'd all have to ratify the 13th Amendment. Lincoln will pocket veto this. In other words, he refuses to put his name onto the bill, and Congress was out of session, so the bill dies. We'll never know exactly what Lincoln would have done, because Lincoln, well, unfortunately, in 1865, while visiting Ford's Theater, John Wilkes Booth will shoot him in the head, and within a few hours, Lincoln will be dead. He becomes our first president, unfortunately, to be assassinated. He gave the last full measure, if you remember in his Gettysburg Address, those who gave the last full measure of devotion. And in some respects, the Gettysburg Address is prophetic when it comes to Lincoln. You can almost argue that he is the last martyr of the Civil War, which left us with a void for presidency, because we wind up with Andrew Johnson. Yes, everybody, that guy, Andrew Johnson. Boy, everybody loves this guy. I mean, seriously. It's pretty sad indeed. It's a pretty bizarre situation that happens here. Johnson was not a Republican. He is a Democrat that supported the Civil War. He supported the Union. He was from the South. He was from Tennessee, which made him what we call a war Democrat. The Republicans were very afraid that they would not win the election of 1864. The Civil War was not going well, and they thought that the North was tired of Lincoln, and they would vote for a Democrat. And the Democrats nominated a former general that Lincoln had fired, a guy named George McClellan, who claimed because he was a general and he had friends on both sides of the army that he could bring peace. This scared Republicans, so they got themselves a Democrat to balance the ticket. They actually didn't even call themselves the Republican Party. They called themselves the Union Party. Very, very bizarre. We just kind of want to just look over this part of time and forget it even happens. But now he's the President of the United States. Turns out he's not a nice person at all. He is a pure believer in Herrenvolk philosophy. He is angry towards aristocratic white plantation owners, the wealthy, because he comes from very, very poor, humble beginnings. He's our only president to never have any schooling. He didn't learn to read and write until he was 18 or 19 years of age. Now he's president of the United States, and he decides that he will reconstruct the South. Once Congress goes into out of session, once it goes out of session in the summer of 65, he immediately declares amnesty to all Southern individuals except the highest ranking ones. As long as they revoke secession, they repudiate their war debts, and they ratify the 13th Amendment, he will reconstruct them. So one state after the other, he declares reconstructed. The South begins to hold elections, and they begin to nominate men to represent them in the Senate, and they elect individuals to be in the House. And when everyone's ready to go back into session by late fall, early winter, it looks as though all these Southerners are going to take over Congress again, which angers radical Republicans. They will actually lock the doors of the Capitol building, not allow these Southerners to come in and take their seats, and start passing a series of laws to deny Johnson a right to reconstruct the South and order Reconstruction all over again. So now you have the battle that begins between the president and Congress over Reconstruction. Ooh, look at this. All right, one of the things that Johnson didn't like was something that was passed earlier called the Freedmen's Bureau. an agency, one of the first ever federal agencies to try to help people. This was to help refugees as well as former slaves, to help them find a place to live, to bring clothing and food to individuals. There is a lot of homelessness right now in the South, even to set up some education, set up some jobs. Congress decided in 1866 to extend this bureau, make it a little bit stronger, give it direct funding, also give it the power to investigate any mistreatment of African Americans in the South. Congress also decides to add to this a civil rights bill, guaranteeing Southern black men their basic civil rights, which eventually will lead to voting. Johnson, being someone who does not believe that African Americans are anywhere equal to whites, he will veto both these bills. This brought the radical element and the moderate element of the Republican Party together. Both sides unite, and now they're going to fight Johnson on everything. They will override his vetoes, and they will pass these two bills. Now, you might be wondering, what in tarnation is this thing? Well, you have something, Lands Bureau. You're going to have a lot of former abolitionists, Northerners, who in their heart of hearts want to come down and help the South. You're going to have doctors and nurses and teachers and carpenters, bricklayers. I mean, a lot of different professions of individuals who want to come to the South because it's in their heart. They want to do the right thing, and they want to help literally rebuild the South. The South will hate this. They start calling these Northerners carpetbaggers. Anyone from the North who comes to the South to try to help, the Southerners will refer to them as carpetbaggers. Now, this comes from this idea that, see, during wartime, there's a lot of things that you cannot easily purchase anymore because things are needed for the war effort. For instance, luggage. The material used to make luggage went for the war effort. You've got to make wagons, you have to make uniforms. There's a lot of things you have to make for the war. There is no luggage to be purchased in the North. Well, some individuals would literally take their carpets, cut out giant squares, sew the two ends together, put handles on them, and create homemade luggage for themselves. Hence, carpetbagger. Now look at this person's face. This obviously is a Southern political cartoon, anti-Northern. This would not be a political cartoon that comes from the North. This is how the South viewed them. I guess it's sort of like when a wife has her mother-in-law come into her kitchen and try to tell her how to cook a meal. That doesn't go over too well. And that's what starts to happen here. Plus, it should be noted, not everyone came with good intentions. Whenever there's a disaster, there are always those people looking to take advantage of it. Here in our local area, for instance, you probably don't know, you're too young, but the last time we had a hurricane come through, there's always individuals who come by within a week or so claiming they can fix roofs, fix fences, anything broken. They'll take money up front, and then they leave and you never see them again. Very, very dishonest. That also will take place as well. There will be certain Northerners who will come down and basically steal Southerners, pretending that they're going to help do something and then not doing it at all. So unfortunately, with the good, there does come some bad. But let's get back into what's happening also in the South. Because of the 13th Amendment, can't have slaves anymore. But Southern states begin to enact black codes. They start to decide we're going to keep our relationship between whites and blacks exactly the same. You won't be slaves in name only. In practicality, though, we're going to keep you slaves. You're going to have contracts that say that you will continue to work the farms. If we find out that you do not have labor contracts working farms, you're going to go to jail. It was a way of keeping the races separate and keeping blacks on the farms and working. Guaranteed supply of labor for Southerners. Eventually, this will lead to the sharecropping system, which we talked about in class the other day, and I'll talk a little bit more about it on Monday. This is extremely terrible. This will eventually lead to, by the turn of the century, what we call Jim Crow laws, where they start to pass various laws to keep the races separate, and segregation. This also leads to segregation. Well, here's your 14th and 15th Amendment. I'm not going to read these. You can read them yourself. But there is one very important word that is missing in both of these amendments. The 14th Amendment deals with if you're born or naturalized, you are in fact a citizen of the United States. Here in the 15th Amendment, your right to vote. Race, color, previous condition of servitude. There's a word that's missing here, and it should also appear up here. And the word is da-da-da-da-da. Notice I didn't use any sound effect. I just used my voice. I'm sorry. Gender. The word gender does not appear. Here in that key concept we looked at earlier, the women's rights movement becomes very angry over this. That they thought that they too would get the right to vote because of the 14th and 15th Amendments. But they are not. They're going to be denied their right to vote. So this is going to keep suffrage going. Let's see, 1860s, 70s, 80s, 90s, turn of the century, almost 50, 60 years, we're talking. 1920 is when women will finally get their constitutional right to vote. Johnson tries to fight back in 1866. This is midterm election. That means all of the House of Representatives are up for re-election and a third of the Senate. So he goes on a speaking campaign throughout the North. He calls it Swing Around the Circle, where he tries to convince Northerners that the Republican Party is destroying the country. There's a problem here. Johnson is a terrible speaker. He likes to drink quite a bit. And when people heckle him, yell at him, he tends to yell back, oftentimes with very colorful swear words. And some of these little swing around the circle rallies become quite entertaining indeed. Imagine your President of the United States, Barack Obama, yelling and screaming at crowds instead. I have to tell you that I will not accept it. I'm not going to do that. That's ridiculous. I'm going to move on. So, radical Republicans control Congress. You get the Charles Sumner. Remember our good friend Charles Sumner in the Senate? He is the leader of the Senate, and Thaddeus Stevens becomes the leader of the House of Representatives. Both of these are radical Republicans, and they get past the Reconstruction Act of 1867. This divides the South into 5 military zones. So this is how they will eventually reconstruct the South. No states, 5 military zones, some of which will be one whole state, like Texas is a zone of itself. Others will include 2 or 3 states in them. And you'll have military governors. They'll be under martial law, and they'll have to do as the North tells them to do, rebuilding their industry, their infrastructure, trying to bring civil rights to African Americans, denying the right to vote to former Confederate leaders. For instance, Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee will not be allowed to vote anymore. In fact, they will also lose their citizenship as well. And the radicals decide it's time also to get rid of Lyndon Johnson. Man, I really am messing up a lot here. I apologize for anyone who's listening to this. Andrew Johnson. And they want him out, so they passed this weird law called the Tenure of Office Act. What they decide is that if a president of the United States dies or has to leave the office, the vice president, upon assuming the duties of the president, cannot fire anyone in the cabinet until they themselves win their own election. That's a stupid law. It is, in fact, unconstitutional to do this. But they're trying to goad Johnson into a fight, and he takes the bait. He he suspends Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. He replaces him with Ulysses S. Grant. The Senate overrules this. They reinstate Stanton, and in February of '68, Johnson now fires Edwin Stanton. He is now in violation of this law, and they impeach him. Now, I want you to understand something about impeachment. Only the House of Representatives can impeach a government official. To impeach means to accuse you of committing a high crime or misdemeanor, and that's how it's worded in the Constitution. A high crime or a misdemeanor. What a high crime or a misdemeanor is, well, that's up to Congress to decide, not you and I. But only the House can formally accuse you of a crime. Then it goes to the Senate. The Senate decides if there's enough evidence here to warrant a trial. Johnson is our first president to ever be impeached. He's our only president to go on trial. When that happens, the Senate acts as the court. Members of the House become the prosecutors. It was an 11-week trial. It was the trial of the century. Hundreds and thousands of people came buying tickets to come see this trial. The President of the United States is on trial. Well, he wins. But it's interesting. One vote short of the 2/3 vote needed to put him in jail. In other words, instead of 35, if he'd gotten 36 to 18, he'd have gone to jail. Many people believe this was on purpose. The Senate knew they really did not have the grounds to fully impeach him and put him in prison. But this humiliated Johnson. It weakened the power of the president, and it allowed Congress to now assert itself as the dominant political force in America. For the next several decades, in what we're going to be going into the Gilded Age, Congress, not the president, will basically be running this country. All right. Well, that's it for this little lesson. Sorry for all my flubs and mishaps. I decided I got too far into it to want to change and go all over again. Don't forget to do the video log. If you're not going to be in school this week because there is a 3-day vacay coming up, you can always, remember, take your video log and you can upload it to Edmodo, or you can email it to me directly. All right. If I don't see you until a week, have a good time. Bye-bye.